And our stream is live.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Pastor Dohle, and I serve King of Kings Lutheran Church in Pueblo, Colorado. I have with me Rabbi Daniel Bogard, and he serves as rabbi at CRC Congregation in St. Louis. We have as our guest tonight, Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers and a researcher. And we thank you very much for being with us tonight. So let's start with our questions.
So thank you for being here, Katherine. I've made my way through about half of your book, and it's brilliant. And your editorial in the New York Times, as well as a number of other really interesting podcasts that if you folks Google your name, they can find out on the interwebs. So you have been on the Christian nationalist beat for really over a decade, really before this was at the forefront of our discourse and in our politics. We'd just love to hear some background on how you got into covering this movement and what you think about the history of it and how it relates to us today.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank both of you for joining me in conversation today. And I want to thank everybody listening in to this conversation about, frankly, a difficult topic, religion, politics, and the rise of religious nationalism. I first started getting into this topic in 2009. I was living in Santa Barbara, California, and a Good News Club came to our daughter's public elementary school. Now, Good News Clubs are designed to convert very little children, kids in their earliest years of learning, into a deeply fundamentalist form of evangelical Christianity, a kind of on the reactionary end of the evangelical spectrum. And they used their position in the schools to get kids to recruit other kids to the club. And frankly, I engage in the kind of dialogue that is a kind of almost like faith-based bullying and bigotry we saw in many public schools in our area, how kids attending the clubs were targeting other kids who are members of religious minority groups or Catholics or kids who are attending the supposedly wrong kinds of churches, telling them that they were going to go to hell because they didn't go to the right kind of church, they didn't believe in Jesus. Now, we're talking little kids here. Little kids like as young as 5, 6, 7 years old cannot make a distinction between an activity that takes place in their school and one sponsored by their school. They think if it's happening in their school and it's taught by adults in their school, it must be what the school wants them to believe, because public schools have a cloak of authority in their minds. So I thought these clubs were wildly inappropriate in a diverse public school setting, but I also at first thought they were kind of a relic of the American past. And it turns out I was wrong about that. The more I learned about the clubs and the movement that they represented and the organization that was forcing their way into the public schools, and the legal strategy that had allowed them to be placed in public schools in the first place, the more concerned I became. I was really kind of stunned by the movement's legal sophistication, by its determination, by its coherence. The people who were leading the clubs referred, they were making use of a taxpayer-funded resource, the public schools, in order to, promote their religion. But the most astonishing thing is that they expressed so much contempt for our public schools. They called our public schools government schools, and they called our children, and they called them the mission fields, and they called our children the harvest. They described our public schools as scenes of spiritual battle. And I found this kind of contempt for the places where 90% of Americans educate their school children. I found this contempt for this institution of public education quite alarming. So I published a book on, kept digging deeper, recognized that Good News Clubs were just one small part of a larger attack on public education. I published a book about that in 2012 called The Good News Club, and kept writing, digging deeper, and investigating further, and discovered that the attack on public education was just one small part of a larger attack on America as a modern constitutional democracy, And so I published The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism in 2012. And, I just keep researching different aspects of this movement. So that's really where my journey began. And I continue to learn more almost every day.
So we probably have on this webinar many people who are either unfamiliar with the term Christian nationalism or possibly have just started hearing about it in the news or whatever. How would you define what Christian nationalism is and is not?
Well, the first thing to know is Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It is not a religion. It's a political phenomenon that involves the exploitation of religion for political purposes. I think of it as combining two different things. On the one hand, it's a set of ideas, an ideology. On the other hand, it's a political movement, an organized quest for power. As an ideology, it boils down to the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. Christian, of course, here referring to a conservative or reactionary conception of the religion. They say that our laws should be based on the Bible, and they have this idea that all of our problems stem from the fact that we have forsaken the supposed heritage of our founding. So there's a kind of ethno-nationalism built into it. They say that what makes America great is fidelity to this allegedly conservative Christian heritage, and if we strayed away from that, the right kind of Christians need to, quote unquote, take it back. But this ideology is really just a tool for a leadership-driven political machine that turns this story, this mythology of America's founding, into political power. And the machinery consists, it's leadership-driven, and it's also driven by a number of organizations. And you can group the organizations into different categories. I'm going to describe some of those categories briefly. There are right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy groups, a very large sort of legal advocacy sphere. There are pastoral organizations. The movement operates in some degree through some faith-based networks, such as, I would say, Watchmen on the Wall is a big one. They draw in conservative and conservative-leaning pastors into networks and do presentations to them to try to, tell them, these pastors, which issues should matter in election cycles, and they give them tools for turning out their congregations to vote. The movement includes networking organizations that get different factions of the leadership on the same page, different leaders of organizations on the same page. There are, of course, legislative initiatives and a kind of far-right messaging sphere that unfortunately devotes a lot of effort to spreading conspiracism these days, a lot of conspiracism, messaging about the culture war issues of the moment, the issues that they get the rank and file to vote on certain issues. And much of the movement functions as a kind of giant voter turnout machine. It's a way of persuading a large subsection of the American public to vote for the political candidates that this movement favors. I don't think we can really understand what's happening in American politics today without understanding this movement and how it functions, without understanding how unified this infrastructure is and how powerful it is. A lot of people say, who are the leaders of the movement? Well, there is a leadership cadre, but it's driven by different organizations. So some leaders, come up and some fall out. So I'll just, give you a brief example. There's an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's one of the leading legal advocacy groups of the of the movement. Their last fiscal year budget was $102 million a year. So it's very, very well funded. They had a head for many years named Alan Sears, and he stepped down, and another fellow named Michael Ferris stepped in to lead the organization. He recently stepped down, and a lady named Kristen Wagoner stepped up. So it's like this leadership sometimes changes, but the organization is still very solid. So the movement has invested in the infrastructure, this infrastructure for decades. And that's, the strength of the movement comes from that organizational infrastructure.
That's incredibly fascinating to think of this as a top-down movement. It's so different than how I normally conceive of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the relationship of this movement of Christian nationalism to a phrase and an idea that I think has come to the forefront in many people's minds of white nationalism, and the way that white nationalism has become part of the political ether that we all swim in America, and just broadly the relationship of Christian nationalism to race and racism.
It's a really fascinating question because there's so much to say, and it's a pretty nuanced picture right now. Christian nationalism ties the idea of America to specific cultural and religious identities. So it's a kind of way of signaling who properly belongs in the country and who does not. I think for substantial white majorities of the rank and file, the idea of religious heritage is tied up or closely bound up with ideas of racial heritage and racial difference. And of course, Christian nationalists are fighting the culture wars on behalf of a political party that has made race-based voter suppression and race-based gerrymandering a key part of their strategy, their political strategy. They paper over the ways in which hyper-conservative religion and racism can reinforce one another. And frankly, they have thrown their support behind political leaders who directly appeal to sectors of their supporters through racism, through racist dog whistling or racist messaging. But, and of course, the ideology of Christian nationalism draws on a deep history of, the idea of America as an authentically Christian nation, laws rooted in the Bible, laws should be based on the Bible, hierarchies ordained by God. This was the ideology. These were ideas embraced by pro-slavery theologians prior to emancipation. There were also ideas embraced by segregationists, people like Bob Jones, who called segregation God's established order and said that, this sort of, if you don't have this kind of God's established order, it leads to chaos and amorality and things like that. And they use this idea of reactionary, hierarchical, obedience-focused religion to enforce social hierarchies and hierarchies of race and gender. But the role of racism in the movement today is complex, and the movement is not all white. Heads of the leading religious right policy groups and their affiliated organizations, I'm thinking about groups like Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition. Ralph Reed is one of the movement's most astute and seasoned strategists. They are actually doing quite a lot of outreach to pastors of color who are conservative leaning or conservative in order to capture a subsection of voters of color. They're also sensitive to accusations of racism, so they make a great effort to sort of promote the appearance of diversity within their movement, and there's some success there. They've made a special effort with conservative Latino voters of faith in certain swing districts, and have frankly had some successes in those areas, and voter trends sort of reflect that. Now, I do want to say that movement leaders today are sensitive to accusations of racism. So sometimes they'll decry racism, but racism is frequently cast as a sin problem exclusively, and leaders will sort of thread that needle by saying, well, racism is a sin, but the only solution to sin is the liberty of the gospel. So it's an unwillingness, frankly, to take on the root causes of racism or take on structural racism or, question the policies of their favored political candidates who are trying to engage in race-based gerrymandering and a lot of racist dog whistling through the sort of fake CRT panic in other areas. They're also, movement leaders are very much trying to hollow out a lot of the functions of government. They don't believe in public education. They don't believe that, many of them don't believe the government should be supporting a social safety net. So it's if you think about some of the policies, especially around voting, that the movement supports, the fact that, many of their affiliated politicians are putting into place laws where there's an old lady like waiting in line to vote, you can't bring her a glass of water and a chair. I mean, stuff that's really frankly targeting a lot of voters of color, you can see that there is very much a kind of racism baked into a lot of the activity of what they're doing, regardless of their efforts to, diversify the appearance of their movement.
So yeah, it sounds like racism, it becomes more of an individual sin then, rather than a thing of the movement. That's fascinating. So how does this movement actually get anything done? Like, tell us about what the infrastructure looks like. You've talked about how it's been top down, but describe that infrastructure for a little bit.
Well, it's really interesting that the movement works in many ways through this kinds of infrastructure. I'm going to give you just a few examples. They have targeted the courts. They recognized, some of the leaders recognized years ago that a lot of the policies they want to bring about are frankly quite unpopular, but if they can get the courts, they can change society in the ways that they want. So they have invested a tremendous amount of money in promoting the careers of lawyers and potential justices and right-wing justices with the correct sort of ideological bona fides. So for instance, there's an organization called the Federalist Society, led by a fellow named Leonard Leo, who has his organization and a range of affiliated organizations have mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars to promote these types of justices. There was a spectacular expose in the Washington Post several years ago by a journalist named Robert O'Hara, who traced the money behind the Federalist Society and many of its affiliated organizations. All 6 current conservative justices on the Supreme Court have current or former ties to the Federalist Society, and 90% of Trump's appellate judge appointees had ties to the Federalist Society. So that's one way in which they do. I mean, here's another way in which the movement works. Thinking about organizations like the Family Research Council, or they along with other organizations have done a lot of presentations to pastors. They'll gather a number of pastors at a church for an event, either a breakfast or a luncheon, and they'll do these presentations and give them voter guides, messaging materials. They'll say, you got to get your congregations out to vote. One of these events that I went to, one of the presenting pastors said the church is not a cruise ship, the church is a battleship. They do presentations on America's supposedly Christian founding. They know very well if you can, number one, if you can get the pastors, you can get a subset of their congregations, and they give sometimes the pastors very sophisticated data tools that are intended to get their congregations out to vote. They also have given them, things like sermon starters, voter guides that rank candidates on maybe 2 or 3 issues. They know if you can get people to vote on 1 or 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So, like, for instance, this is a movement that has a wide range of economic, social, and foreign policy aims, but they get people to vote on the sort of culture war issues of the moment. So let's say if you want to get rid of public education or hollow out Social Security, how do you get the rank and file to vote for those things? Well, you get them to vote on abortion. If you want to deny a range of Americans a number of individual rights, if you want to get sort of diminish the right to vote, or engage in race-based gerrymandering, or endorse policies that are going to intensify economic inequality, erode the rights of the workforce, you get the rank and file in a panic over same-sex marriage. I mean, the irony here is that this is a movement that claims to stand for family values, but they're driving support for politicians whose economic policies are actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed.
So you mentioned how they interact with the family council. Can you tell us how they interact with some of the other religious movements like Watchmen on the Wall or Church United or Faith Wins, or some of those other ones that I think one of the ones that I was reading about was Acts 29. And I'd be really interested to know how the Christian Nationalists have used that network.
Well, Acts 29 is a parachurch network. So it's a number of different churches that are placed, around the country and frankly, around the world. And a lot of parachurch networks just work that way. There are also progressive parachurch networks. But Acts 29 and other sort of conservative leaning parachurch networks are often very politicized. I've been to a number of churches that are frankly engaging in the kind of the kind of politically focused rhetoric that could be easily considered to violate the 501c3 status. I want to tell you what happened when I went to a megachurch in Chula Vista, California. It was this event was put on by an organization called Church United. It was drawing Latino and Anglo, but mostly Latino pastors into this mega church, and there were perhaps 400 people in the mega church. It was a really fascinating event, and it was held in the Spanish language. And there were the presenters were saying, you've got to get your people out to vote. You've got to get them to vote, against the homosexual agenda. Have to get them to vote on abortion. And it was giving them there's this very interesting moment when they passed out material, and this is all in the Spanish language. They passed out a sheet of paper with a sort of mashup of graphics and text and said, they're teaching these things in the public schools in the health education classes. And you need to, and I looked at the sheet, and it was supposedly stuff being taught about sexuality, and it was very disturbing. The graphics I saw, the information that I saw was very disturbing and seemed frankly inappropriate for a public school environment, certainly at the ages where they suggested it was being taught. So, and then they said, then on the other side of the sheet of paper, they had a list of politicians' names, and all but one were Democrats. And they said, all of these politicians support this. So it was all a bunch of Democratic names. So I had to do some fact checking. So I called up a number of school districts and showed them the materials. And I said, are you teaching these in your health education classes? Well, nothing on this sheet of paper was being taught in any public school district that I could find in the manner in which it was suggested or taught at all. They suggested that some of the materials were being taught at the kindergarten level, and they were actually taught at the high school level, where it may be appropriate to learn more about your, puberty and sexuality and things like that. And then many materials that were on the sheet were not being taught in any public school at all. But they know that by getting these pastors upset about what's allegedly being taught in the public schools and communicating these issues to their congregation, they can actually get a subset of those congregants to vote for them.
So one of the things that's entering into the public consciousness, particularly for American Jews these days, is that right-wing, vocally Christian nationalist leaders are talking about the right sorts of Jews and the wrong sorts of Jews, and in particular singling out Orthodox Jews, who are a very small minority, right? 9% of American Jews are Orthodox, as being sort of the right kind of Jews, and that all the rest of us need to get on board or get out. In fact, I believe former President Trump said something almost exactly like that recently. So I'm wondering, what is the role that these vulnerable minorities, whether we're talking about American Jews, whether we're talking about LGBTQ community members here in the United States, how do these vulnerable minorities and targeting them unite the movement? And how is it chosen? How does it happen? Which of these groups are being targeted for these purposes?
That's a great question. If you look at the way, I would say, any kind of religious nationalism works, it's a way of dividing people between the supposedly righteous and the supposedly unrighteous, the insiders and the outsiders, right? It's about symbolic boundaries, who gets to properly belong in the nation and who does not. And the thing about the hated groups in a society as inherently diverse and pluralistic as ours is that these people and groups never go away, right? Religious nationalists have a lot of targets, including liberal and moderate Christians, LGBT Americans, members of religious minority groups, secular folks who, frankly, I think are the more hated perhaps than almost any other group, who they cast as being responsible for everything bad that's happening in America. But this is how religious, I would say, authoritarianism works. It relies on a very familiar set of tools. So there's the sense of scapegoating, scapegoating a sort of impure other and blaming that group for all of the problems of a society. They also, the persecution narrative is very common. This is something that religious nationalists in America also make use of. You spend enough time in these circles and you're constantly hearing that conservative Christians are the most discriminated group in American society, and that they're engaged in an apocalyptic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil, and the consequences of political loss are too dire to ignore. And frankly, that makes folks prepared to do anything, no matter how radical, to defend from the apocalypse. So, I mean, these are very familiar tools in the authoritarian playbook. Another very common tool that we're seeing among Christian nationalists today, unfortunately, is the use of misinformation, conspiracism, separating people from the facts. Propaganda really works. And unfortunately, we're seeing the mainstreaming of QAnon, which is not religious, it's definitely not Christian, but often it's adjacent to some of these religious nationalist circles. We're seeing the mainstreaming, certainly, of the election conspiracism. When I was at a Faith Wins event in Virginia, there's another gathering of dozens of pastors that are being sort of indoctrinated in the right, Christian nationalist talking points and given voter guides, et cetera. So I saw David Barton's son speak, Tim Barton. David Barton was ill that day, so he was unavailable, but his son gave a presentation, and Chad Connolly was there from the Council for National Policy, telling all the pastors that, they really need to engage their congregations in politics. But then they brought with them somebody they billed as an elections integrity specialist named Hogan Gidley. He was a former member of the Trump administration, and he was there to basically spread lies about the election. This was several weeks after the investigation in Arizona. You guys probably remember, was a Republican-led investigation, and they had found nothing. I think they found maybe a couple dozen extra votes for Joe Biden. But it was a Republican-led investigation, and there was turned up absolutely nothing. And Hogan Gidley was there. He said, "You saw what happened in Arizona. This is really terrible." I mean, it was astonishing. I thought it's been everywhere in all the news that this Republican-led investigation turned up no corruption, no fake votes, to speak of. And yet here he is still spreading these lies. And he's not going to discard them simply because they're not true. I mean, he's also talking about, there's a lot of dead people voting and all this other, he's basically spreading conspiracism and lies. But that's another sort of tool in the authoritarian playbook. If you can separate a large subsection of the population from the facts, it makes them a lot easier to control.
So I'm struck both in the way you're speaking today and in your writings, the way that you talk about this as a top-down movement. And it really has changed my whole conception of this movement. So would just love to hear you speak a little bit about who is setting this agenda and how the agenda is being set.
Yeah, thanks. That's it's an important feature of the movement is that it is leadership driven. When you're talking about the rank and file, you're talking about a very wide range of people with different interests and backgrounds and ideas. And many, members of this group vote identity and not policy. So when they're voting for candidates to want to end abortion, for instance, or defend the American family, they're not explicitly aiming for major fundamental ways in which the American government is organized. They're really making a statement about who they are and value, what they value in themselves. They often identify that, are they Christian nationalists themselves? Perhaps not. I mean, certainly not everybody who lends their support to this movement is a Christian nationalist. But what they might be doing, if you're allowing these single culture war issues to determine the way you vote alone, then you are lending, support to a Christian nationalist agenda. So, I think for these members of the rank and file, they, unlike their leaders, they don't see themselves as calling for a revolution. They just want to sort of see a certain set of values reflected in our politics. But for the leaders of the movement, the heads of the religious right policy groups, the networking groups, etc., they're really after power, both for themselves and for the networks that they are part of, for the political leaders that they support. Many of them look forward to a time when only Christians in their approved versions of the religion are in charge of all major functions of government and society. And they're also looking forward to a time when they can rely on the government for several things. Number one, policies that privilege certain religious and political viewpoints and disparage other religious and political viewpoints. And number two, a flow of taxpayer money to their initiatives and their organizations.
So what is the end game here?
Well, the end game is, I think, the end game for a lot of folks who are aiming for power, influence for themselves and their political allies, a steady stream of taxpayer funding, and policies that favor approved religious and political viewpoints. Look, this is a movement that supported Trump's coup attempt, and it defends him when there is overwhelming evidence that he engaged in espionage. It rejects democratic elections. It rejects the principles of equality and pluralism and justice that represent the best of the American promise. And so I think that it's really important to see that it's a movement that's actually set itself against democracy. But it's also important to note that religious nationalism in practice almost never comes to an end in a genuine theocracy. When they say they want their laws based on the Bible, doesn't really, how does that really work out? I mean, it certainly won't result in a Christian democracy. The natural destination of religious nationalism is kleptocracy, cronyism, nepotism, led often by irrational and autocratic leaders, in which an organized hypocrisy takes the place of religion. We see this in other parts of the world when you have sort of would-be autocrats or autocrats surrounding themselves, binding themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious leaders in their own countries. What they're doing is they're sort of bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, and that inhibits any democratic check on their power, on their corruption, and we've seen examples of this all over the world.
So I want to talk about what role culture war issues have on this movement, particularly abortion and same-sex marriage. But I also want you to go into a little bit about how the movement has had to adjust after Dobbs and with the elimination of Roe versus Wade as a organizing unit. How have they had to adapt, as particularly in states that have such strict abortion laws already?
Yeah, you know what? The culture war issues, that's a great question. They're like the shiny baubles that get the rank and file to vote a certain way. If you can get people to vote on a single binary issue, you can control their vote. So movement leaders have concentrated their messagings on these issues. And for many years, these issues were abortion, same-sex marriage. Today, they've expanded the culture wars to include some stuff in public schools, and we can get to that later. But when it comes to abortion, they're just getting started. I mean, it's long been a goal of the movement to overturn Roe versus Wade. But the way I do my research is I go to these national conventions and strategy gatherings and meetings, and almost every year I try to go to the National Pro-Life Summit in Washington, D.C., where you see, and they want to introduce, and they say it, they say we want to introduce an amendment, a constitutional amendment banning abortion from the moment of conception or fertilization in the entire country, but that's going to take some time to set up. So they've also said things like, we're going to take the battle to the states. They're crafting long arm of the law, sort of legal as kind of a legal theory that will allow those who are opposed to abortion to sue providers in other states. They're crafting ways to go after legally providers of abortion medication who might be sending pills to people who want them in other states. I mean, they're really not going to sit back on their laurels now that they've overturned Roe versus Wade. They're really after, they call it often abortion abolition. They really want to end abortion everywhere. And we know that this is going to affect not just people who want sort of abortions, but also people who need maternal medicine. It's going to affect maternal medicine in really fundamental ways. I mean, 1 out of 5 known pregnancies ends in miscarriage, and a significant number of those miscarriages require a medical procedure known as an abortion to complete in order to avoid developing sepsis or hemorrhage or a number of other complications. So these bans on abortion are going to affect women across the board, maternal medicine across the board, and already are. When we look at, in advance, we're just a few days before the midterms, right? And we're not too far from the next presidential election. And my prediction, I'm starting to see it already, is that the movement is going to go a little bit quiet on abortion because a very substantial majority of Americans support the right to choose. They just very substantial majority identify either as pro-choice or support access to abortion in a range of circumstances. So this is one of those policy positions that's frankly unpopular among most Americans. So they're going to be a little quiet about it and focus on some other stuff because they don't, they want people to sort of not have it at the top of their minds when they go to the ballot box.
So the hot topic issues that I've heard most talked about have been abortion and same-sex marriage and critical race theory. CRT is like humongous talking point. So tell us a little bit about that and why that is such a sticking point for this movement.
CRT, it's amazing. There was the thing about CRT is that it's an example of a manufactured controversy. It was in fact manufactured by a right-wing activist named Christopher Rufo at the right-wing think tank, the Manhattan Institute. He's the architect of all the sort of anti-CRT stuff that we see happening today. He wrote this on Twitter. He said, I'm going to paraphrase here. He said, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think CRT, critical race theory. And he said, I can't remember the exact language, something like, we have decodified the term. We're going to recodify it to have a range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. So basically, he wants people to hear the word CRT or the phrase CRT and think of stuff that they don't like. It's being exploited to tap into a range of anxieties. And this is being done with a tremendous amount of strategic coordination. There was a report in Media Matters last June. In the prior 3.5 months, critical race theory was mentioned on Fox News nearly 2,000 times. But by comparison, in November 2020, there were just 4 mentions. So it really shows that what happened is they sort of came up with a strategy. They said, we're going to find this thing that and attach a range of meanings to it that Americans don't like, and then we're going to push that. Now, the thing we need to remember about real CRT is it was never, ever part of primary or secondary education in the United States. It was barely taught at university level. It was a little subsection of some graduate schools in some places in the country that a few people were sort of paying attention to. But it was, as Christopher Rufo, the architect of the strategy, called it, decodified and recodified in order to stir up anxieties over race, kids, identity, education, and public education on all sides. And it's really been weaponized as an identity issue. And I believe that it's, these manufactured panics are serving as distraction from the ways that the religious right is actually denying people a range of other fundamental individual rights that affect our lives in really substantial ways, like the right to vote, the right to send your kids to well-funded and well-run public schools free from proselytizing, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to have maternal medicine determined by best practices and not religious dogma, the right to privacy, the right to contraception. I mean, the right to love who you want, and as another adult who you want. I mean, let's not forget that the religious rights push for a total ban on abortion is wildly unpopular, but they're pivoting to these other culture war issues now that poll better. I mean, they do their sort of polling and they figure out what issues are going to poll well, because it distracts from their unpopular policies and their failures and the corruption of their political leaders.
So I think for many American Jews today, the Israeli elections are on our mind, and in particular, what looks like the rise of an Israeli Knesset that is going to include pretty hard right, pretty scary Jewish religious nationalists. So I know Israel and Israeli politics are not your specialty, but would love just to hear any thoughts you have about the relationship between American Christian nationalism and religious nationalism all over the world in all of its various forms that seems to be rising.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. I mean, I think that sometimes religious nationalism is easier to recognize when it's happening in other countries. So when you have leaders like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Modi in India, or leaders in Iran, right? When they're binding them, when these like leaders are binding themselves to reactionary religious figures in their countries to consolidate power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And they're using religious nationalism to shield themselves from transparency, to distract from any abuses they may be perpetrating against their own people. We're certainly seeing that in Iran, where you have women and men fighting for rights that they have long been denied: the right to free speech, the right to free expression, the right to assembly, the right to freedom from discrimination based on religion or based on gender, the right to feel the wind in your hair. And what does the leadership do? They say this is, represents a heresy, and this is not, they're suggesting that these folks don't properly belong in the nation, and are blaming others, religious others and other foreign powers, to distract from the ways in which they've been oppressing their own people. But we've seen the radical right become close to or part of the political mainstream, I would say, across a number of contemporary democracies. We look at the new Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. She has similarly used this language of exclusionary nationalism. Her party, Brothers of Italy, emerged out of neo-fascist political movements and are predictably against gay marriage, abortion rights, globalism, what they call it. The word globalism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but to some people it just means the Jews. And they collaborate close with a lot of religious nationalist and far-right groups. There are a lot of similarities with these groups. They're anti-democratic. They don't believe in legitimate power comes from the people. So they're often against democratic elections. They use propaganda to keep people in line. They often use that persecution narrative, and typically they also scapegoat. A lot of similarities in a lot of these different places, even though there are nuances specific to different countries.
So one of the arguments that I always hear is that, well, this movement really isn't Christian, or these Christian nationalists, they're not Christian like we are. We're real Christians, they're fake Christians. It's sort of the whole no true Scotsman argument there. So I wanted to ask if you could explain Christian nationalist roots in other Christian traditions besides white evangelicalism.
Absolutely. Listen, the movement, first I want to say that, when you spend time in these spaces, they are worshiping with as much passion and intensity as everyone. I mean, it's really important to recognize that Christianity is incredibly diverse. Most religions are incredibly diverse, religions of any substantial size. And there are a lot of different ways to be a Christian. And but the movement is not just about white evangelicals. I've heard a lot of people describe it as a white evangelical movement. Well, the movement includes many white evangelicals, but it excludes many white evangelicals too, and many evangelicals of color. And it also draws in representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. Movement would be nowhere without the involvement of a cadre of ultra-conservative Catholics. And I think to an underappreciated degree, the movement is now reaching out to charismatic, Pentecostal, and neo-charismatic pastors. So the movement even derives support from some people who do not identify as Christian at all. I'm thinking about people like, well, Peter Thiel, who now says he's a Christian, but he seems more motivated by a kind of libertarian economics. Something about people like Bar Said, who just donated $1.6 billion to found a group called the Marble Freedom Trust. And he's Jewish, and he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. I mean, so the movement is, what unites it is not so much any particular theology, but more like a common political vision.
That's so interesting. I had just been reading a study that was talking about a small group, small relatively, of right-wing American Jews who have, in the post-Trump era, started describing themselves as evangelical. And what they mean by that is that they are right-wing religious nationalists. Obviously, there's no such thing as evangelical Jews, and yet there are people who are describing themselves that way. So I'd love to turn the conversation just a little bit. This is a question close to my heart and close to my family. It strikes me that more and more trans kids in particular are a target of the discourse and of the laws of this movement. We'd just love your help understanding the why of that.
Yeah, I think that gender anxiety is in some ways the rocket fuel of the movement. And I think that the whole trans issue does arouse a tremendous amount of anxiety about gender order. The movement is at its core, very deeply patriarchal, even though there are some women in the movement who have power and have some, public say. The movement does sort of adhere to a patriarchal view of the family. But the trans issues tend to completely, fly in the face of that. I remember when reading texts early on, like even books published 20 years ago, where they're talking about the women's rights movement, and they're saying, well, they're trying to erase gender, as though like if women actually have the right to, fair employment and fair wages and education and the like, all of a sudden gender doesn't exist. And there seems to be this, movement is really gripped by this anxiety about gender order. And so I think that's a large part of it. It's demagoguery, isn't it? And it appeals to people through, appealing to their sort of instincts, their sort of base instincts and issues of identity. And there's no issue of identity that is more likely to arouse strong feelings than issues around gender and sexuality. So it's become a very useful tool for the movement. But, it wasn't really, it's again, a kind of a top-down decision. They do their market testing. They figure out which issues they can, get a subsection of people who are actually liberal on. So and then they find ways to sort of, it's not enough to say, well, there's some trans kids and we don't want them, to have their rights. They got to start talking about groomers and pedophiles and stuff like that. Make this whole hyperbolic, argument that's, based in many instances on just lies. So they do that again to distract from their larger agenda, and also to distract from the corruption of their chosen leaders, and to distract from their own failures.
I have to say personally that it's it's utterly ridiculous how they think, because in Utah, for instance, transgender issues are a huge thing. For one child, there's one trans kid in the entire state. They passed all of these laws against trans kids playing in sports. The kid doesn't even play in sports. So anyway, I think it's kind of bizarre the way that, and it's good to hear that they do their research and stuff, because they're not really even talking about anything that's even an issue. It's not like there's, hundreds of trans kids all trying to play sports or anything. And in the whole state, there was one, and that poor kid didn't even play sports. So anyway, I wanted to get back to your book, because I did read it, and I thought it was one of the scariest books I've ever read, and I read horror books for fun, so I had to take it one chapter at a time. But I did notice that your book basically centers on what I would call the Trump years, and there has been 2 years since that. So what has changed? What has grown? If you could write an appendix to your book, what would you write in that?
Well, I think the big thing that's changed is that we had an overt coup attempt. It's a real test of whether people would pick party or country. And there was a real choice between choosing the agenda of Christian nationalism and protecting our democracy. And Christian nationalist leaders have made their choice. They said that their agenda is more important than protecting our democracy. That was frankly their position beforehand, but it was really never made clear. And I think we, the general public or the media or whoever, we didn't know, or we could pretend it wasn't really happening. We could tell ourselves that they were ordinary actors within a large, noisy, pluralistic democracy. And but now we know that that's not the case, because we can't understand what happened on January 6th without understanding the role of this movement and its leadership, who promoted the lie of the stolen election as soon as Trump came out with it, and promoted it very actively through a lot of their networks. And also we saw the use of all that sort of signage, the ideology of Christian nationalism played a huge role, because a lot of the violent groups that were storming the Capitol, they had been persuaded that Trump was God's guy. Trump was what God wanted, God's chosen leader. So if the other guy won, it must be against God's will. And so they persuaded themselves that any action, no matter how radical, was justified in order to restore God's will and save America from the apocalypse. I don't know if you guys saw any of the footage of those, what they called Jericho marches right before January 6th, where you had a lot of religious folks standing up and praying for the salvation of the nation, and saying we're going to fight against the devil and demonic forces and things like that. So I mean, that's something that really, when it happened, I have to say it was kind of a shocking moment. But the biggest shock was when Christian nationalist leaders kind of sided with the insurrectionists and sided with the coup attempt, and said, okay, well, we need to stand behind the January 6th guys, because these are good guys. And we have to figure that out. Right now as a nation, we need to grapple with the fact that we have a movement that is controlling one of our major political parties, that has no respect for democratic elections and other key features of our democracy. It's kind of a hard pill to swallow.
So I have one last question for you, and I'm going to kind of bring some of the couple questions that I saw in the question and answer chat to bear as well. So I am a progressive Christian leader, and I know that others on this call may be as well. There's a group called Faithful America that fights Christian nationalism, but we're kind of wondering how do we do our part, both as individuals and congregations, particularly when, as we've already discussed, we are very much a part of the problem as well. So how in the world, what do we do, and how do we go forward in making a positive difference?
I see you as part of the solution. I think that there are many faith leaders on the moderate and liberal and progressive side that are pushing churches to be more active in their political engagement without being partisan. This is an extremist minority movement that's had a disproportionate influence in our politics, precisely because so many churches have been, and others have been, silent about it. So there are many organizations such as American Values Coalition that are training pastors to combat disinformation. I think that's really important. Then there are others like Faithful America, Red Letter Christians, Baptist Joint Committee, the Coalition of Churches, and many others that are sounding the alarm. Others, organizations such as the Poor People's Campaign, are making solidarity with those who are they're trying to sort of help get out the vote, trying to, have solidarity with those who are kind of, I would say, left behind by this movement. And they're trying to sort of, organize folks. I'm not endorsing any particular one of these organizations or the myriad of others, but faith leaders are not silent, shouldn't be silent anymore. I think that it's all the major progressive political movements in America have succeeded because of the partnership of faith leaders. I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, even the Clergy Consultation Project, which got behind Roe versus Wade and the right to choose, right to reproductive freedom. There are so many different organizations that have contributed to social justice and articulated the values of equality and justice and over time. And so I think that faith leaders have an extraordinary role to play here.
So, Rabbi Bogard, do you have any last thoughts?
I'm just so grateful. Katherine Stewart, thank you for being with us today, joining us from down in New Orleans. Appreciate the friend who lent you their office to join us. Encourage folks to read your book.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you both.
Yeah, I too wanted to express my thanks for all of it, for all the kind emails all the way through and everything, and for writing your book. I have to say, I finished the whole thing, and I applaud you, not only for your excellent investigative reporting, but for actually being in these situations. I read through your book, and there were at least 24 situations I thought I could not have kept my mouth shut. And I really don't know how you did, but I really do applaud you. You wrote an excellent book, and I really do appreciate this conversation tonight as well.
Thanks. I mean, I want to note that a lot of the folks who are members of the rank and file in this movement are very nice people. They love their families, they care about their communities, and they really do believe that they're doing what's best for our country. But if you look at their collective efforts, they've been harnessed in service of an agenda that's frankly polarized our country as never before, that has mainstreamed misinformation and frankly made our country harder to govern. We have a lot of real issues that we can only solve when we come together as a country. Issues related to healthcare, improving our healthcare, improving education, improving infrastructure, improving conditions for the workforce, generating kind of improving our national security, improving our economic health overall. And a lot of the culture war issues that are being pushed by the right today are frankly distracting from our ability to come together and solve these issues. And it's making our country, frankly, more irrational and less governable. And frankly, I think that's by design. It clears the way for an authoritarian reaction. But that's not what most Americans want. We have to remember that we are the majority of the country. Most Americans, Christian and non-Christian alike, reject the principle, like that sort of politics of conquest and division, and really would like to see some of our, the best of the American promise restored. So I think if it's an all hands on deck moment, everybody has a part to play, and we are still, the tools of democracy are still available for us to try to restore democracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you again. The book, I think I accidentally muted myself when I was saying it before, but the book is The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It was published in early 2020, but still incredibly relevant and terrifying, but important. Also, thank you, Pastor Dohle, for putting this together and for inviting me to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Rabbi. And yeah, and thank you everyone for logging in and tuning into this.